I've always loved nighttime taxi rides. There is something mystical about driving through dark streets when the city sleeps, and the streetlights flicker like ghosts from the past. In those moments, I felt like I became part of this nocturnal world, full of secrets and mysteries. But one ride changed everything. It was an ordinary Thursday. I finished work late and called a taxi to get home. The night was cold and windy, and I wanted to get to my warm bed as soon as possible. Within a few minutes, an old Cadillac pulled up. The driver looked unusual, a tall, thin man in a black hat and long coat. His face was hidden in the shadows, and I couldn't make out his features. I got into the back seat and gave him the address. The driver nodded silently and pulled away. Soft, melancholic music played in the cabin, only intensifying my sense of unease. We drove for a few minutes, and I noticed we were deviating from the usual route. I leaned forward and asked, "Excuse me, where are you going? This isn't the way to my house." The driver didn't respond. I tried again. "Excuse me, do you hear me?" The driver remained silent, his gaze fixed on the road. I started to get nervous. Thoughts swirled in my head. What's happening? Why is he silent? We left the city limits, and I felt my heart start to race. There were only dark fields and forests around, no souls, no cars. I tried to stay calm and address the driver again. "Stop the car! I want to get out!" But he kept driving. I realized something was very wrong and decided to act. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. Panic gripped me. I started banging on the windows, shouting, but it was all in vain. The driver remained inexorable. We stopped at the edge of the forest. The driver finally turned to me, and I saw his face. It was deathly pale, his eyes cold and empty, as if there was no soul in them. He quietly said, "Do you know why I brought you here?" I felt cold sweat on my forehead and couldn't say a word. The driver continued, "This is where people disappear. You are not the first and not the last." My body froze with fear. I tried to get out of the car, but the doors were still locked. The driver got out of the car and started walking around it. I realized I had only one chance to escape. I gathered all my strength and kicked the window with all my might. The glass cracked, but didn't break. The driver was already approaching my door. I didn't give up and continued to hit. Finally, the window shattered into pieces. I jumped out and ran into the dark forest. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs barely held me on the ground. I heard the driver shouting after me, but I didn't stop. The darkness of the forest enveloped me. Branches grabbed at my clothes. My face hit thorns. But I didn't stop. My only thought was to run as far away from this creepy place as possible. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like an eternity. Finally, I saw a light between the trees. I ran toward it and found myself in a small clearing. There stood a house, old and abandoned, but the windows were lit. I didn't think and rushed to the door. They were open. I ran inside and closed the door behind me. I breathed heavily, my heart still pounding. The room was silent. I listened, but I didn't hear anything suspicious. Maybe I managed to escape my pursuer. I looked around. The house was old but clean. Paintings hung on the walls. The furniture looked antique but well kept. I felt a slight relief. Maybe I would find shelter and help here. I went to the window and looked outside. The forest was dark and impenetrable, but I didn't see any signs of the driver. Maybe he gave up. At that moment, I heard a faint noise behind me. I turned around and saw a woman standing at the end of the hallway. She was dressed in an old-fashioned dress, her face pale, and her eyes as empty as the driver's. "Who are you?" I whispered, feeling a chill run down my spine. She didn't answer. She just stood there and looked at me. I felt the ground slipping away from under my feet. What is this place? Why does everything look so strange here? The woman finally spoke. "You came here to find answers, but you'll only find more questions." I took a step back, feeling fear overwhelm me again. Something was very wrong here. I started backing toward the door, trying not to take my eyes off the woman. "You need to leave here before it's too late," she continued. "This place holds dark secrets. Sometimes it's better not to know the truth." I opened the door and ran outside. The forest seemed less scary compared to what was inside the house. I started running without looking back. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing. I had to leave this place as quickly as possible. Finally, I saw car lights and heard the hum of an engine. I ran onto the road and started waving my arms, hoping to be seen. The car stopped, and a middle-aged man got out. "Are you all right?" he asked, seeing my face. "Help me," I whispered, feeling tears well up in my eyes. He helped me into the car and asked what had happened. I started telling him everything that had happened, but he listened with doubt. "You need to rest," he said finally. "I'll take you to the nearest hotel. There you can calm down and think everything over." We drove for a few minutes, and I finally felt like I could relax. But when we pulled up to the hotel, I saw the familiar Cadillac in the parking lot. My heart started to beat faster again. "That's him," I whispered. "That's the driver." The man looked at me with concern but said nothing. We got out of the car and headed to the entrance. I kept looking around, trying to see the driver. The hotel was quiet and empty. A young woman greeted us at the reception with a smile. "Good evening, how can I help you?" she asked. "We need a room," said my companion. "My friend here is a bit distressed. He needs to rest." She nodded and gave us a room key. We went up to the second floor and entered the room. It was small but cozy. I sat on the bed, feeling the exhaustion overwhelm me. "Are you sure everything will be all right?" I asked, looking at the man. He nodded and smiled. "Rest. I'll be nearby if you need anything." I lay down on the bed and closed my eyes. Sleep came quickly but was restless. I dreamed of nightmares about dark forests and empty eyes. When I woke up, it was already light. I looked around and realized the man was gone. I got up and went to the hallway, but I couldn't find him anywhere. I went downstairs to the reception and asked about him. "He said he had to leave," the woman replied, "but he left this for you." She handed me a small pouch. I opened it and saw an old medallion inside. It had a name engraved on it that I didn't recognize. "What is this?" I asked, looking at her. She shrugged. "He said it was for you. And one more thing." She leaned closer and whispered, "Be careful. There are many secrets here." I took the medallion and left the hotel. I knew this was just part of a larger story, and the answer was still waiting for me. But one thing was clear. The night taxi passenger would never be the same again. My name is Emily. The evening at work dragged on, and I left the office almost at midnight. The fatigue from a long day weighed heavily on me, and I eagerly awaited getting home as soon as possible. Stepping out of the building, I pulled out my phone and ordered a taxi through a popular app. Within minutes, the car appeared on the horizon, pulling up to the curb. "Emily?" the driver asked, confirming the order. "Yes, that's me," I replied, getting into the back seat. The driver seemed like an ordinary middle-aged man with a friendly smile. We started moving, and I felt a slight relief knowing I would soon be home. The first few minutes of the ride were quiet, with only the soft whisper of the radio filling the space between us. However, the driver suddenly started asking questions. "Do you often work this late?" "Sometimes," I replied, not giving much thought to his curiosity. The questions kept coming, becoming more personal. "Do you have a boyfriend? Where do you live? What's your phone number?" I felt increasingly uncomfortable, my anxiety growing. I tried to turn away, looking out the window, hoping he would take the hint and stop questioning. But the driver persisted. "Do you always travel alone at night? It's dangerous." I started realizing that something was wrong. My heart began to race as the driver suddenly turned onto a road that was not on the navigator. I knew my route and understood that we were heading in the wrong direction. "Excuse me, but this is not my road. Where are we going?" I asked with evident anxiety in my voice. "I know a shorter way," he replied with a barely noticeable smile. "Don't worry, everything will be fine." The road grew darker, the buildings turned into trees, and I realized we were somewhere on the outskirts of the city. My heart pounded in panic as the driver stopped the car near a small house with darkened windows. "This is my home. Do you want to come in? I have something interesting that you'll like." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. I quickly gathered all my strength and lied. "Sorry, but I need to get home immediately. Someone is waiting for me." I saw the driver's expression change to disappointment, but I didn't waste any time. When he got out of the car to open my door, I quickly jumped out and ran as fast as I could, not looking back. Panting and frightened, I stopped at the nearest lit area and called another taxi. It took me home, where I could finally relax, although fear still lingered in my heart. The next day, I decided to report the incident to the taxi service. The operator listened attentively and assured me that the driver would be fired to avoid a scandal. But this didn't bring me peace of mind. Late that evening, while I was home alone, my phone vibrated. I received a message from an unknown number. "I know where you live. You can't escape." I panicked, trying to calm down, but fear took over me again. I called the police and told them everything that had happened. The officers arrived after some time, but the driver had already disappeared. They promised to patrol the area, but this didn't ease my tension. I decided that I needed to leave. I quickly packed my things and left the city, hoping the driver wouldn't be able to find me. My new home was far from everything familiar to me, but I felt safe. Time passed, and the fear gradually started to fade, but the memories of that night remained with me forever. I started a new life, but always remembered that sometimes even the most ordinary journey could turn into the scariest nightmare. I began taking self-defense classes to never feel defenseless again. I also became more cautious in choosing transportation, only using trusted services, and always sharing my location with close ones. My life returned to normal, but the sense of danger lingered somewhere in my subconscious. One day, a few months after that incident, I met with my friend Mia, to whom I decided to tell about that terrifying night. Mia was shocked and even a bit scared after hearing the story. She promised me that she would always be there and help if necessary. "You know, I never thought this could happen to me," I said. "But now I know that you always need to be careful and trust your instincts." Mia nodded and took my hand. "We'll look out for each other, and now you're not alone." I smiled. I felt the support and love from my friend, and it gave me strength. Together, we decided to create a support group for women who had experienced similar situations to help them not feel lonely and defenseless. Another year passed, and the support group founded by Mia and me grew and became well known in our city. We held meetings, self-defense training, and psychological consultations. I found new meaning in my life and realized that my terrifying experience helped me become stronger and help others. I no longer feared going out at night, knowing that there was always someone who would support me in case of danger. I found peace and tranquility in my heart, and the horrible memories of that night gradually dissolved into the past. But I always remembered that even the scariest events could lead to something good if you don't give up and fight for your happiness. I never encountered that driver again, and his threat remained just a memory. I continued living, creating new, happy memories and helping others find their strength. My story became an example for many women who learned not to be afraid and to believe in themselves. I've been working as a taxi driver for over 10 years. In this line of work, nothing surprises me anymore. I've had countless strange passengers, but the night of October 15th is one I'll never forget. I was on shift in the city that never sleeps. The nighttime always brings unusual stories, but this one made me rethink my life. Around 2 in the morning, I stopped at the intersection of 5th Avenue and East 52nd Street. I was sitting in my car, listening to old jazz and watching the city pulse with lights. Suddenly, out of the darkness, a man in a classic black suit and hat appeared. He looked like he had just stepped off the cover of an old glossy magazine. He approached my taxi and quietly said, "I need to go to Western Clough, please." Western Clough is an old district on the outskirts of the city, known for its abandoned buildings and neglected factories. I was surprised why someone would want to go there at night, but my job isn't to ask questions. I just nodded and we set off. During the trip, the passenger didn't say a word. He just looked out the window, lost in his thoughts. His silence was a bit eerie, but I decided not to bother him. The city's streets gradually became darker and less populated until we reached nearly deserted areas. I began to feel a strange unease, but I didn't stop. Finally, we arrived at Western Clough. The passenger asked to stop near an old factory. This place had been abandoned for many years. "Wait for me here, I'll be right back," he said, stepping out of the car. His words were so calm that I couldn't help but comply. He disappeared into the darkness, and I was left sitting in the car, feeling increasingly anxious. About 20 minutes passed. The passenger didn't return. I started to get nervous and decided to get out of the car to look for him. In the darkness, I saw a silhouette quickly moving towards me. It was my passenger, but something was wrong. He looked terrified, with a horrible panic on his face. "Let's get out of here quickly," he yelled, getting into the car. I didn't ask what had happened and immediately drove off. On the way back, the passenger quietly sat in the back seat, holding something in his hands. He didn't take his eyes off this object, as if it was extremely important. Eventually, he said, "You shouldn't have come here. This place, it's cursed." We stopped at the same intersection where we had started our journey. The passenger got out of the car and, without turning back, threw a bundle of money on the seat. I opened it, and inside were old banknotes that had long been out of circulation. When I looked up to see where the passenger had gone, he was already gone. I couldn't believe what had happened. I decided to return to that factory the next day to understand what had scared my passenger so much. When I arrived there during the day, the place looked even more abandoned and airy. I dared to go inside and found an old room full of old things. Among them was the same object my passenger had held at night, an old photograph. It depicted a family, and I recognized his face. It was him, only much younger in the photo. I returned to my car and never drove to Western Clough again. I still don't know what happened that night, but one thing I know for sure: there are places better left untouched, especially at night. This story changed me. Now, when I drive at night, I'm always on alert, because who knows who or what I might meet next on my route. You may not believe me, but I felt what I felt, and that night will forever be a reminder that darkness can hide many secrets better left undisturbed.